What is the greatest miracle that anyone can imagine? Usually, when people think of great miracles, they are thinking about a resurrection. Somebody was dead, but somehow or other they miraculously came back to life. Well, have you ever heard the story of a nation that died and came back to life? That's what we're going to talk about here in the Old Testament history. It's a story of a nation that died and came back to life. Israel's history can be summed up in three major eras. The first era in the Old Testament is the era of the judges. And then the second era would be the era of the kings. And then the third era in Israel's Old Testament history is the post exilic period. So, the first era in Israel's Old Testament history is the era of the Judges. And there are three books in the Bible associated with the era of the Judges. They are Joshua, Judges, and Ruth. Uh, If you know from the law, which I talked about beforehand, Moses was the lawgiver. He had led the Israelites up to the promised land, but he didn't actually lead them into the promised land. He actually had his successor, Joshua, lead them into the promised land. So Joshua became the first judge. And Joshua led the conquest of Canaan, where they uh, got rid of all of the Canaanites and other ites that were occupying that land. And then the land became divided among the 12 tribes, and each tribe got its own allotment of land. Towards the end of the book of Joshua, he reminds Israel the importance of their duty to be loyal to God. And also in here is a prophecy Joshua made about the rebuilding of Jericho, which would take place in King Ahab's lifetime sometime later on. Following the book of Joshua, we have the book of the Judges, where various judges are ruling after Joshua. Some of them are Jephthah, Gideon, Deborah, Samson. Um, there are a number of short stories here. They talk about how the tribe of Dan gets established. And one really sad era takes place where the tribe of Benjamin is nearly wiped out. The book of Ruth is basically a short story that takes place. It talks about how God rescues a family from basically impoverishment. And that family winds up becoming the ancestors of the future King David, which we'll talk about later. The next era, which takes place after the era of the judges, is the era of the kings. And the books of the Bible that pertain to the era of the kings are First and Second Samuel, First and Second Kings, and First and Second Chronicles. There are several important people that pertain to this era. The first one being Samuel. Now, Samuel was not a king. He was actually the last prophet. I mean, the last judge, not the last prophet, but the last judge. He also served as a prophet and as a priest. Um, it was common in that era that sometimes the priests would also serve as judges. So Samuel actually becomes the last judge, and he serves well for his time period, but there is a really big enemy that they have that's called the Philistines. And the Philistines are a lot of trouble for Israel, and Samuel's hope is that God is going to eventually deliver Israel from the Philistines. So, what God does is he has Samuel anoint Saul. Um, this is actually done, ironically, in part against God's will because the people are begging Samuel for a king, And in doing so, they've rejected God as being their king and being their salvation. But Samuel listens to them. He goes ahead, he anoints Saul as king, and Saul starts out well. But later on, Saul starts seizing power and he starts going his own way and he begins rejecting God's voice. Um, and he actually becomes an evil king. So God eventually says, I've rejected Saul, but Saul is still king. So God has Samuel anoint a boy by the name of David. And David actually winds up being the one who rescues Israel from the Philistines. But before he can do that, he actually goes into hiding from Saul because Saul is trying to kill him. So Saul eventually dies in battle, and David becomes the next king. He actually rescues Israel from the Philistines. He restores worship in the tabernacle, and the kings actually become very, very powerful at this point. At this point, Israel is much more highly organized, and they are actually able to subdue all of their enemies under King David. And after King David dies, his Solomon becomes king. His son Solomon becomes king, and Solomon actually begins the golden age of Israel. Israel becomes very prosperous, very wise. And so Solomon actually builds the temple. Instead of a tabernacle, we now have a temple, and the ark is laid to rest at the temple. But later on in Solomon's life, he introduces idolatry to Israel. And that causes Israel to be divided into two kingdoms. Now we have the northern tribes of the nation of Israel, and then we also have the southern tribe of Judah, which also becomes a nation. Uh, the northern tribes of Israel, they reject David and his descendants, and they start having a king of their own. Whereas the nation of Judah, they follow David and his descendants. Some of the most notable people in the nation of Israel were evil King Ahab. Ahab introduces the darkest era of Israel's history. All the kings were bad in Israel, but Ahab was the worst. And God raises up a prophet by the name of Elijah to challenge Ahab. And Elijah keeps Ahab on his toes and sort of keeps Ahab from becoming too evil. And Elijah also introduces a revival in Israel. King Josiah from the nation of Judah, he's a pretty prominent king as well because by this time, the nation of Israel is wiped out. And the nation of Judah is all that's left. But the kings of Judah have actually gone very, very evil. They become very, very evil. And they have caused a lot of idolatry. Um, but when Josiah becomes king, he finally decides that he wants to serve the Lord. And he finds a book and of the law, and he's like, we're going to follow the book of the law, but the thing is it's got some curses in it. And they are letting Josiah know that his nation is about to be destroyed. And in fact, both of the nations were destroyed. Israel was destroyed by the Assyrians first. They were taken away to Assyria to be slaves there. And the people of Judah were destroyed later on by Babylon. And they were taken away to Babylon to serve as slaves there to King Nebuchadnezzar. And at this point, the Israelites are so badly weakened, they are nearly extinct. The remnant that exists are basically just slaves. And so, in a very real sense, the nation of Israel was dead. Now I'm going to move on to the post-exile era. Okay, so they've been exiled to Babylon. They serve under Babylon for about 70 years, and then finally, Persia takes over Babylon. Medo-Persia takes over Babylon, and After that, King Cyrus actually lets the Israelites, along with other peoples, go back over to their homelands. So, uh, Israel actually goes back to their homeland, and the key books in this era, the post-exile era, are Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther. There's some key movements where the Israelites are moving back. The first person who's very prominent is Zerubbabel. Now, Zerubbabel was actually a descendant of the kings, and it's very likely that Zerubbabel would have become king himself if Babylon had not conquered Jerusalem. But in this instance, he serves as a governor to the Israelites because Israel is no longer an independent nation. They are now subjects to Persia. So he serves as a governor uh, for the Israelites underneath Persia's government. And when Zerubbabel comes back, he leads a good number of people back to their homeland. And during this time, when Zerubbabel's governor, the Israelites make it their ambition to rebuild the temple. And they try, but they are not successful. They have tried to rebuild it, but they are only able to lay down the foundation. And then the Samaritans, or other peoples of the land, come along and they stop them from their rebuilding. So, some years later, Ezra the scribe comes over and he leads a group of people with him over to Israel from Persia. And under his leadership, the Israelites are able to rebuild the temple. They restore the worship to God. Ezra is a very prominent person because he's able to keep Israel from wandering. He stops intermarriage from the people. And at this point, the Israelites stop pursuing idols. Uh, the next one that comes along the line is Nehemiah. He's actually a servant to the king over in Persia, and he leads some Israelites over with him over to Jerusalem, and he actually serves as Jerusalem's governor for a period of time. And his role over here was to rebuild the walls. At this point in time, the Samaritans that were living in the land caused a great deal of hardship and threats to Israel, and he knows that the Israelites need security over in Jerusalem. And the best way to provide that security is to rebuild the city walls. Uh, the next one is Esther, Queen Esther. Um, she does not lead anybody back to Israel. She's actually one of the Israelites that remain over in Persia after the others have gone back. But she is actually able to rescue the Israelites from a threat of actual extinction. So Israel comes back in the post-exile era, and they are much more humble. They are a much smaller group of people than they were back in David's time. But at this point in time, they have firmly committed that they are going to serve the Lord, and that is the history that is provided for us in the Old Testament. So, by observing the Old Testament history, we see how a nation has died and actually come back to life. Israel comes into Canaan land as a weak and disorganized nation, but they become much more organized and powerful under the leadership of the kings. But idolatry causes Israel to become a weakened nation, and ultimately they become destroyed. The northern tribes of Israel are destroyed by Assyria, and the southern tribes of Judah are destroyed by Babylon. But even though this nation is now dead, they are actually raised back to life when the Israelites resettle into their homeland. A verse of scripture that sums up Israel's Old Testament history can be found in Ezekiel chapter 37, verses 11 and 12. I'm reading from the NIV version. It says, "Then he, speaking of the Lord, said to me, Son of man, these bones are the people of Israel. They say, Our bones are dried up, and our hope is gone. We are cut off. Therefore prophesy and say to them, This is what the sovereign Lord says. My people, I am going to open your graves and bring you up from them. I will bring you back to the land of Israel." If you know the story in Ezekiel chapter 37, the Lord brings Ezekiel over to a valley of dry bones. And he says, Son of man, can these bones live? And Ezekiel says back to God, You know whether or not those bones can live. Uh, and then the Lord leads Ezekiel through a series of prophecies where Ezekiel is supposed to proclaim messages to the bones, and the bones actually develop skin on them, and then they come back to life. And then the message here that the Lord is providing to Ezekiel is these people that have died and come back to life are the nation of Israel. And so when I lead the nation of Israel back to their promised land in Israel, that will be a nation that, though it had once been dead, has now come back to life. This is important because the death and rebirth of Israel is actually a foreshadow of the death and resurrection of Jesus. And it's also a calls us to die to our sinful ways, to die from our sinful self, so that we can be again reborn or resurrected in Jesus Christ. If you like this video, please give a like or subscribe. Thank you so much.